"Don't look inside the chest," she begged. The lonely cowboy opened it and lost his breath. The autumn wind cut through the Montana territory like a rusty blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would claim more lives than the summer's drought already had. Jake Harrison pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully down the rocky slope of Eagle's Peak. The year was 1885, and Jake had been riding these mountain trails for the better part of 3 months now, ever since he'd lost his job at the Double R Ranch outside of Helena. At 34, Jake had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines carved by sun and hardship, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a jaw that hadn't seen a proper shave in weeks. His hands, calloused from years of working cattle and mending fences, gripped the reins with practiced ease as Duchess navigated the treacherous path. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below, where scattered pines struggled to find purchase in the rocky soil. Jake had been heading toward the small settlement of Copper Creek, hoping to find work before the snows came, when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was barely human, more like the whimper of a wounded animal, but there was something in it that spoke of desperation so profound it seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. He reined in Duchess and listened, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. There it was again, coming from somewhere ahead and to his left, where the trail curved around a massive boulder that had probably tumbled down from the heights decades ago. Jake's first instinct was to keep riding. In his experience, getting involved in other people's troubles rarely ended well, especially out here where the law was as scarce as fresh water in August. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and Jake found himself dismounting before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. He tied Duchess to a stunted pine and made his way around the boulder, his boots crunching on the loose shale that covered the narrow ledge. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. A woman lay crumpled against the rock face, her dark hair matted with blood, her traveling dress torn and stained with dirt and something darker. She appeared to be in her 30s, with delicate features that spoke of a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier existence. Beside her sat a wooden chest, ornate and out of place in this desolate setting, its brass fittings gleaming despite the circumstances. Jake dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly. He'd seen plenty of death in his time, ranch accidents, Indian raids, shootouts in saloons where whiskey flowed as freely as blood. But there was something about this woman's condition that made his stomach clench with unease. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of deep water. They focused on his face with an intensity that seemed impossible given her condition. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind that whistled through the rocks. You have to help me," she gasped, her fingers clutching weakly at his sleeve. "The chest, you have to take it. You have to." Jake glanced at the wooden container, noting its fine craftsmanship and the heavy brass lock that secured it. "Ma'am, you need a doctor. Let me get you to Copper Creek. There's bound to be someone there who can—" "No." The word came out with surprising force, and she struggled to pull herself upright against the rock. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, and Jake could see that whatever had happened to her, she wasn't going to survive it. "There's no time. You have to listen to me." She reached out with trembling fingers and grasped his wrist with a strength that belied her condition. Her eyes, bright with fever and something that might have been fear, locked onto his with desperate intensity. "Promise me," she whispered, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Promise me you'll take the chest and keep it safe. But whatever you do, don't look inside. Don't ever look inside. Ma'am, I don't understand. What's in there that's so— Promise me." The urgency in her voice made Jake's skin crawl. "There are men coming. Dangerous men. They've been following me for weeks, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way. If they find the chest—" Her voice trailed off as a fit of coughing seized her, and when she pulled her hand away from her mouth, it was stained crimson. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Who are these men? What do they want?" "The chest," she gasped. "They want what's inside. But they can never have it, never." Her grip on his wrist tightened. "You seem like a good man. A decent man. Will you help me?" Jake looked into her eyes and saw something there that made his throat constrict. It wasn't just fear or pain. It was a kind of desperate hope. The look of someone who had been carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. Against every instinct screaming at him to walk away, Jake nodded. "I'll help you." The relief that washed over her face was almost heartbreaking. "Thank you," she breathed. "In my dress pocket, there's a key, but you must never use it. Never. The chest must stay locked no matter what happens." Jake found the key, a small brass thing that felt warm in his palm despite the cold air. He tucked it into his vest pocket, feeling its weight like a stone against his chest. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Eleanor Ashford. And yours?" "Jake Harrison, ma'am." She smiled then, a weak but genuine expression that transformed her battered features. "Thank you, Jake Harrison. You may be the only decent man left in this godforsaken territory." As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Eleanor Ashford drew her last breath, her hand still clutching Jake's wrist. He sat there for a long moment, listening to the wind and feeling the weight of the promise he'd made to a dying stranger. Finally, he closed her eyes and lifted the chest. It was heavier than he'd expected, and something inside it shifted with a sound like papers rustling. The brass lock gleamed in the fading light, and Jake found his fingers unconsciously moving toward the key in his pocket. He stopped himself, remembering her desperate words. "Don't ever look inside." As he secured the chest to Duchess's saddle, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn from which there would be no going back. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later, just as Jake was making camp beside a shallow creek that wound its way through a stand of aspen trees. The golden leaves rustled overhead in the evening breeze, and Duchess was drinking her fill from the clear water, when Jake heard the distant sound of hoofbeats on the rocky trail behind him. He'd been riding hard since leaving Eleanor's body on that desolate mountainside, pushing both himself and his horse through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced travelers. The chest remained securely tied behind his saddle, its presence a constant weight on both his horse and his conscience. More than once he'd caught himself staring at it during their brief rest stops, the brass key seeming to burn a hole in his vest pocket. Now, as he listened to the approaching riders, Jake felt his jaw clench with grim certainty. Eleanor had warned him about dangerous men, and his instincts told him these weren't fellow travelers looking for directions to the nearest town. He quickly doused his small campfire and moved Duchess deeper into the trees, his hand instinctively checking the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. The chest seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if it somehow knew that the men Eleanor had feared were finally catching up. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Jake could make out at least 3 distinct horses moving at a steady pace. They weren't hurrying, which meant they were confident in their tracking abilities. Jake had done his best to cover his trail, but 3 days wasn't nearly enough time to disappear completely in country this open. Through the aspen leaves, he caught his first glimpse of the riders as they approached the creek. The man in the lead was tall and lean, wearing a black duster that had seen better days and a hat pulled low over his features. Even from a distance, there was something predatory about the way he sat his horse, scanning the ground for sign with the patience of a man who had done this many times before. The other 2 riders flanked him. One was stocky with graying hair visible beneath his weathered hat, while the third was younger, maybe in his 20s, with the kind of restless energy that suggested he was quick to violence. All 3 were armed, and Jake noticed that their horses showed signs of hard riding, foam still visible around their bits and saddle blankets dark with sweat. "Trail leads right to the water," the lead rider said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. There was something cultured about his accent, as if he'd received an education back east before ending up in this harsh country. "She came through here, no question about it." The older man dismounted and knelt beside the creek, studying the muddy bank where countless animals had come to drink. "Horse prints are fresher than the others, maybe 2-3 days old, and look here." He pointed to something Jake couldn't see from his hiding place. "Boot prints. Man's boots, size 10 or 11. She's got someone with her now." Jake's blood ran cold. They weren't just tracking Eleanor. They were tracking him. "Could be anyone," the younger man said, his voice tight with impatience. "Maybe just some drifter who happened along." "Maybe," the leader replied, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it for a second. "Or maybe our dear Eleanor managed to pass along her burden before she died." He dismounted and walked to the edge of the creek, his movements deliberate and predatory. Either way, we follow the trail. Thomas Blackwood didn't pay us to come back empty-handed. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood was a railroad baron whose reputation stretched from San Francisco to Chicago, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. If Blackwood was involved in this, then whatever was in that chest was worth more than Jake had imagined. What if this drifter don't want to cooperate? The older man asked, straightening up and wiping his hands on his pants. The leader's smile was visible even from Jake's hiding place, and it was the kind of expression that belonged on a wolf, not a man. Then we convince him, gently at first. He paused, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, less gently if necessary. As the three men mounted up and continued following the trail, Jake waited until their hoofbeats faded into the distance before emerging from the trees. His hands were shaking slightly as he secured his gear to Duchess's saddle, and he found himself looking at the chest with a mixture of curiosity and dread. What could be inside that was worth killing for? What had Eleanor Ashford been carrying that would bring Thomas Blackwood's hired guns into the Montana wilderness? The rational part of his mind screamed at him to abandon the chest, to leave it beside the creek and ride as far and as fast as he could. But Eleanor's dying words echoed in his memory, and the promise he'd made to a desperate woman wouldn't let him go. Instead, Jake mounted Duchess and urged her toward the more difficult mountain trails, paths that would slow down his pursuers but might give him the advantage he needed. As they climbed higher into the thin air, leaving the creek and the aspen groves behind, Jake began to formulate a plan. He needed to reach civilization, somewhere with a sheriff or a marshal who might be willing to stand up to Blackwood's men. Copper Creek was still 2 days' ride, but there was another settlement called Pine Ridge that might be closer if he was willing to risk the more treacherous mountain passes. The chest bounced gently against Duchess's flank as they climbed, its contents shifting with a sound that seemed almost like whispered secrets. Jake found himself straining to make out individual sounds. Was that the rustle of papers, the clink of coins, or something else entirely? By the time full darkness fell, Jake had gained considerable altitude, and the air had grown thin enough to make both him and Duchess work harder for each breath. He made a cold camp in a sheltered hollow between two large boulders, not daring to risk a fire that might give away his position. As he sat in the darkness listening to the wind howl through the peaks above, Jake pulled out the brass key and held it up to catch what little starlight filtered through the clouds. It was warm to the touch, as if it held some internal heat, and for a moment he could swear he felt it pulse like a heartbeat. The temptation to unlock the chest was almost overwhelming. Eleanor was dead, and the men hunting him seemed willing to kill for whatever was inside. Didn't he have a right to know what he was risking his life to protect? But her voice echoed in his memory. Don't ever look inside. Don't ever look inside. Jake tucked the key back into his vest pocket and pulled his bedroll tighter around his shoulders. Whatever secrets the chest contained, they would have to remain hidden for now. He had made a promise to a dying woman, and that meant something in a world where a man's word was often the only currency that mattered. As sleep finally claimed him, Jake dreamed of Eleanor's desperate eyes and the sound of approaching hoofbeats that seemed to grow closer with each passing hour. Jake woke to the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls below. The sharp crack of rifle shots cut through the pre-dawn silence, followed by the unmistakable thunder of horses being pushed hard up the rocky trail. His heart hammered against his ribs as he rolled from his bedroll and crawled to the edge of his sheltered hollow, peering down through the gray morning light. Far below, he could see 3 riders pushing their mounts up the treacherous switchbacks he'd navigated the night before. Even at this distance, Jake recognized the black duster of their leader, and the methodical way they moved told him everything he needed to know. These weren't men who gave up easily. Duchess nickered softly behind him, sensing his tension. Jake quickly gathered his gear, his movements sharp and efficient despite the cold that had settled deep into his bones during the night. The chest seemed to mock him as he secured it once again, its brass fittings catching the first weak rays of sunlight that crested the eastern peaks. The gunshots had been a message, Jake realized. They knew he was up here somewhere, and they wanted him to know they weren't going to stop. The sound would carry for miles in this thin air, a reminder that nowhere was safe as long as he carried Eleanor's burden. Jake mounted Duchess and guided her along a narrow ledge that curved around the mountain's face, staying well above the trail his pursuers were following. The path was barely wide enough for a horse, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and vertical rock on the other. One misstep would mean death for both of them, but it was their only chance to stay ahead of the men below. As they picked their way carefully along the ledge, Jake found his thoughts returning to Eleanor's final moments. The fear in her eyes hadn't just been about dying, it had been about something far worse. What could Thomas Blackwood want badly enough to send killers into the wilderness? What was worth more than human life? The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came a revelation that made Jake's blood freeze in his veins. In the growing light, he could see smoke rising from the direction of Pine Ridge, the small settlement he'd been hoping to reach. Not the thin wisps of cooking fires or heating stoves, but the thick black columns that spoke of buildings burning. Jake reined in Duchess and pulled out the small brass spyglass he carried in his saddlebags. Through the lens, he could make out the distant settlement, and what he saw made his stomach clench with sick certainty. Pine Ridge was burning, and even from this distance he could see bodies lying motionless in the main street. Blackwood's reach was longer than Jake had imagined. Somehow the railroad baron had known where Jake might be heading, and had sent other men to cut off his escape route. The message was clear. There would be no help from local law enforcement, no sanctuary in civilization. He was on his own. A rifle shot cracked from somewhere behind him, much closer than before, and Jake heard the distinctive whine of a bullet ricocheting off rock. The men below had spotted him on the ledge and were taking long-range shots, hoping to get lucky or force him into making a fatal mistake. Jake urged Duchess forward, abandoning caution for speed as they raced along the narrow path. Behind them, he could hear voices shouting instructions, the sound of iron horseshoes striking stone, and the occasional rifle shot that sent chips of granite spinning into the void. The ledge curved around a massive outcropping and opened onto a broader trail that led higher into the mountains. Jake recognized this path from his younger days. It led to an abandoned mining camp called Broken Bell, where prospectors had once searched for silver before the vein played out and the harsh winters drove them back to civilization. If he could reach Broken Bell before his pursuers caught up, he might be able to make a stand. The old mine shafts and tumble-down buildings would provide cover, and there were defensive positions that could give him an advantage even against 3 armed men. But as Duchess labored up the steep trail, her breath coming in harsh puffs of vapor, Jake realized they might not make it. The mare was tough and willing, but she'd been carrying his weight and the chest for days now, and the thin mountain air was taking its toll. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. The 3 men had reached the broader trail and were pushing their horses hard, apparently willing to risk their mounts' lives to close the distance. Jake could hear the leader's voice calling out commands, and there was something in his tone that suggested a man running out of patience. The trail crested a ridge, and suddenly Jake could see the ruins of Broken Bell spread out below him in a narrow valley. The old mining camp consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings in various states of collapse, their weathered wood gray as bone in the morning light. The mine entrance was visible as a dark slash in the hillside beyond the camp, surrounded by the skeletal remains of what had once been processing equipment. Jake pushed Duchess down the slope toward the largest building, an old saloon that still retained most of its roof. As they approached, he could see movement in the shadows between the buildings, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he realized what he was seeing. People. There were people in Broken Bell. As he drew closer, Jake could make out perhaps half a dozen figures moving among the ruins, men in worn work clothes and women in simple dresses that had seen better days. One of them, an older man with a gray beard and suspicious eyes, stepped into the street with a rifle held loosely in his hands. "That's far enough, stranger," the man called out. "State your business in Broken Bell." Jake raised his hands to show he meant no harm, though he didn't dismount. "Name's Jake Harrison. I'm being pursued by men who mean to kill me, and I could use some help." The bearded man studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, his exhausted horse, and the wooden chest secured behind his saddle. "What kind of men?" "The kind that work for Thomas Blackwood," Jake replied, and was surprised to see recognition flicker across the man's weathered features. "Blackwood," the man spat, as if the name tasted bitter. "We know about Blackwood. He's the reason we're hiding up here like rats in the rocks." He lowered his rifle slightly. "Name's Samuel Tucker. These folks and me, we used to have farms down in the valley before Blackwood decided he needed our land for his railroad. When we wouldn't sell, his men came calling with fire and lead." Jake felt a surge of hope. Then you know what kind of man he is, what he's capable of. Tucker nodded grimly. We know. Question is, what's he want with you? Before Jake could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridge above. His pursuers had reached the crest and would be down in the valley within minutes. Jake looked at Tucker and the other refugees who had emerged from the ruined buildings, seeing in their faces the same desperate determination he'd seen in Eleanor's eyes. I'm carrying something that belongs to him, Jake said. Or something he thinks belongs to him. A dying woman asked me to keep it safe, and I gave her my word. Tucker studied the approaching dust cloud, then looked back at Jake with eyes that held the hard wisdom of a man who had lost everything once and refused to lose anything ever again. Well then, Tucker said, working the action on his rifle. Reckon we'd better help you keep that promise. The final confrontation came with the brutal efficiency of a prairie storm. Tucker's people had taken positions among the ruins with the practiced ease of those who had learned to fight for their survival, while Jake found himself crouched behind an overturned ore cart with the chest beside him and his Colt .45 ready in his hand. The three riders entered Broken Bell at a cautious walk, their leader's black duster billowing in the mountain wind. Jake could see the man's face clearly now, sharp features, cold gray eyes, and a thin mustache that gave him the appearance of a gentleman gambler. But there was nothing genteel about the way he held his rifle or the predatory alertness in his posture. You're making this harder than it needs to be, friend, the leader called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the abandoned camp. All we want is what the woman was carrying. Hand it over, and you can ride away from this. Jake remained silent, knowing that any response would only give away his position. Beside him, the wooden chest seemed to radiate an almost physical presence, as if whatever lay inside was somehow aware of the danger surrounding it. I know you can hear me, the man continued, guiding his horse slowly down the main street of the ruined camp. My name is Marcus Webb, and I work for Mr. Thomas Blackwood. The item you're carrying was stolen from him, and he wants it back. Simple business transaction. From somewhere among the ruins, Tucker's voice rang out with the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. Blackwood's business transactions usually involve fire and blood, Webb. We've seen his handiwork down in the valley. Webb's head turned toward the sound, but Tucker had chosen his position well, remaining hidden among the collapsed timbers of what had once been a general store. Ah, Samuel Tucker. I should have known we'd find you up here with the other rats. Webb's smile was visible even at this distance. Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. He was quite disappointed when you and your friends disappeared before he could make you a proper offer for your land. His proper offer came with torches and bullets, Tucker replied. Same as it always does. Webb shrugged with theatrical indifference. Progress requires sacrifice, Tucker. Your little farms were standing in the way of something much larger. The railroad will bring prosperity to this territory. Prosperity for Blackwood, another voice called out from the ruins. Jake recognized it as belonging to one of the women he'd seen moving among the buildings. Death and poverty for everyone else. The conversation was interrupted by a rifle shot that splintered wood inches from Jake's head. The younger of Webb's companions had spotted movement and taken a chance shot, and suddenly the morning air was filled with the deadly music of gunfire. Jake rolled behind better cover as bullets whined overhead. The chest clutched protectively against his body. Around the camp, Tucker's people returned fire with the desperate accuracy of those who knew they were fighting for their lives. The older man with Webb went down first, clutching his shoulder and tumbling from his saddle as his horse reared and bolted. Webb himself had dismounted and taken cover behind a fallen beam, his rifle barking steadily as he tried to pin down the defenders. The younger gunman was moving between buildings, trying to flank Tucker's position, when one of the refugees caught him in the open and put him down with a shot that echoed like thunder off the surrounding peaks. Enough! Webb's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. I'm tired of playing games. The shooting stopped, leaving only the sound of wind whistling through the ruins and the labored breathing of wounded men. Webb stood up from his cover, his rifle held casually in his hands, and Jake could see something had changed in the man's demeanor. The cultured facade had fallen away, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. You want to know what's in that chest? Webb called out, his voice carrying a manic edge that made Jake's skin crawl. You want to know why Mr. Blackwood is willing to kill for it? Jake found himself holding his breath, despite every instinct telling him not to listen. It's evidence, Webb continued, beginning to pace back and forth in the street like a preacher delivering a sermon. Letters, documents, photographs, proof of every bribe, every murder, every burned farm and poisoned well that Thomas Blackwood has ordered in the name of progress. Eleanor Ashford was his secretary for 15 years, and she documented everything. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Eleanor hadn't been carrying treasure or stolen goods, she'd been carrying the truth. Evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. She was going to turn it over to the federal marshals, Webb continued, his voice growing more unhinged with each word. Going to destroy everything Mr. Blackwood has built. But we caught up with her before she could reach Denver. You killed her, Jake said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Webb heard him anyway and turned in his direction with that predatory smile. We didn't have to. The fall from her horse did that for us. But she'd hidden the chest before we found her, and by the time we backtracked to look for it, some good Samaritan had already taken it upon himself to play hero. Jake felt the brass key burning against his chest, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, he understood the true weight of what he'd been carrying. Not just a dying woman's final request, but the hopes of every person Blackwood had crushed beneath his ambitions. Hand over the chest and I'll make it quick, Webb offered, raising his rifle toward Jake's hiding place. Keep it, and I'll make sure you die slow. Jake looked at the faces of Tucker and his people, saw the desperate hope in their eyes, and made his decision. He'd given Eleanor Ashford his word, but more than that, he'd seen what Thomas Blackwood's version of progress looked like. The burned settlement of Pine Ridge, the families hiding in these ruins, the fear in a dying woman's eyes. Go to hell, Webb, Jake called out and opened fire. The gunfight that followed was brief but vicious. Webb proved to be every bit as dangerous as his reputation suggested, his shots coming close enough to spray Jake with splinters and stone chips. But he was outnumbered, and Tucker's people had the advantage of knowing the terrain. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Webb lay motionless in the dusty street of Broken Bell. His black duster spread around him like dark wings. The older gunman had bled out during the fight, and the camp had fallen silent except for the wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Jake emerged from cover, the wooden chest cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. Tucker approached him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, his rifle now held loosely at his side. So what now? Tucker asked. You going to open it? Jake looked down at the brass lock, feeling the weight of the key in his pocket. Eleanor's words echoed in his memory, but they carried different meaning now. She hadn't been asking him to keep the chest locked forever. She'd been asking him to keep it safe until it could reach the right hands. He pulled out the key and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click, and Jake lifted the lid to reveal neat stacks of documents, photographs, and correspondence that would have made any federal prosecutor weep with joy. Tucker whistled low as he looked at the evidence spread before them. This'll bring Blackwood down for sure. Jake nodded, carefully closing the chest. Eleanor Ashford died to protect this. I reckon the least I can do is make sure it reaches Denver. As he secured the chest to Duchess's saddle once more, Jake thought about the woman who had entrusted him with this burden. She'd been carrying the weight of Thomas Blackwood's sins, documenting every crime and atrocity while working in the man's own office. In the end, her courage had cost her everything, but it might just save the lives of countless others. The ride to Denver would be long and dangerous, but Jake Harrison had given his word to a dying woman, and he intended to keep it. Behind him, the people of Broken Bell were already making plans to return to the valley below, knowing that justice might finally be within reach. As Duchess picked her way carefully down the mountain trail, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Eleanor Ashford had been right about one thing. There were still decent men left in this territory. Sometimes they just needed the right reason to stand up and be counted. What did you think of Jake's incredible journey and the shocking truth hidden inside Eleanor's chest? Did the ending surprise you? Or did you see the twist coming? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gripping tale of courage, betrayal, and redemption set in the unforgiving American frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more incredible adventures. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and let us know in the comments what kind of story you'd like to see next.